Good morning, everyone. My name is Carmel Martin. I'm the Executive Vice President for Policy here at the Center for American Progress, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this terrific event this morning. Climate change represents one of the defining challenges of our time. We face rising tides and temperatures, violent storms, and devastating droughts. But while the impacts of climate change will be irreversible, they are not inevitable, not yet. And over the last few years, the United States has made remarkable progress. As a nation, we have developed new and ambitious state efforts to deploy clean energy. We've supported federal initiatives to cut carbon pollution across the economy, especially from the electricity and transportation sectors. And we've joined a historic international agreement in Paris that sets a global course to curb climate change. Our domestic actions will help the United States meet these international goals. President Obama has set an ambitious goal of reducing U.S. emissions by 26 to 28% by 2025. This target is especially significant for the agricultural sector, which contributes to 9% of our country's total greenhouse gas emissions. The National Climate Assessment, a report from more than 300 experts, including those from the Department of Defense and the National Science Foundation, predicts that climate change will place significant strains on agriculture as weeds, disease, insect pests, and extreme weather events increase and intensify. Fighting climate change will not only alleviate these impacts, but also enhance food security and increase productivity for more sustainable practices. These efforts are essential to ensuring that people in the United States and around the world have access to sufficient and affordable food. We saw these future challenges take shape in a food security simulation CAP conducted late last year. We gathered 65 senior policymakers and experts on agriculture, climate, and security to game out responses to a scenario set from 2020 to 2030, in which crop yields and supply chains are severely strained by climate impacts, population growth, and political instability. The evidence was clear. Climate change will drive a future of greater volatility, and we must begin to prepare now. Those in the agriculture sector recognize the realities of climate change. Our conversation today will focus on what policymakers and business leaders are already doing and what future actions we can take to protect American agriculture and stem the tide of climate change. We're lucky to be joined today by U.S. Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack. Under his leadership, the USDA has developed ambitious and effective programs to increase sustainable farming practices that are more resilient to climate change. And he has worked tirelessly to bring together farmers, community organizations, and other stakeholders to engage on best practices for climate-smart agriculture. We deeply appreciate Secretary Vilsack's work, and we're honored to have him at CAP. So please join me in welcoming the Secretary.
Well, thank you very, very much. Got this piece of wood, and I'll explain it in just a second. Let me just simply state this, that American agriculture and forestry is absolutely up to the challenge of climate change and will seize the opportunity it presents. We see this as an incredible opportunity to grow and expand, to be innovative, to be creative, and to meet this challenge. Now, why am I so confident? And I've got 9.5 minutes to talk about 7 years of work at USDA. We started a process of making sure that our farmers, ranchers, and forested owners would be prepared for this future by establishing a series of climate hubs and sub-hubs around the United States that assessed our vulnerabilities and began a process of educating our producers and our landowners as to steps that they could take to mitigate and adapt to a changing climate, and they have embraced those changes. We began a process of working internationally with a global research alliance where we were focusing on crop production, animal production, and rice production in sustainable ways with over 40 countries to make sure that we didn't duplicate or replicate research so that we could accelerate the pace of innovation. And we opened up our vaults, our research vaults, through an open data initiative to make sure that researchers had access to the information that we have accumulated over the years. We also took a look at ways in which we could work in partnership with over 100 organizations and countries in the ClimateSmart Agricultural Alliance that was launched at the UN several years ago to be able to share best practices. So again, we can promote the pace of innovation. And we have aggressively worked with EPA and now over 4,000 partners to focus on the issue of food loss and waste. A third of our food here in the United States and across the world is wasted or lost. It adds to methane. It is a greenhouse gas emitter. We believe we can cut in half our food loss and waste in the U.S. by the year 2030, and we're working today to get that done. But in order for us to really accelerate the pace, in order for agriculture and forestry to contribute to the overall reduction goal that President Obama established for the country, and that allowed us to provide international leadership in the Paris Agreement, we needed to create a series of building blocks, 10 building blocks that we could establish using our traditional and usual programs at USDA to really contribute to emission reductions connected to agriculture so that it could continue to, along with forestry, maintain a positive, sustainable record. Internationally, agriculture is roughly responsible for 14% of emissions. Here in the U.S., as was indicated, it's between 9 and 10%. When you add forestry into the mix, we're actually a net sink. We want to continue to make sure that that continues to be what goes on in the U.S. So these 10 building blocks were announced almost a year ago, and today we're launching our first annual report on how well we're doing. And in that report, you will see precisely what the 10 building blocks are. They're focused on soil health and better water management, nutrient stewardship, working with our forest, both private and public, urban forestry, renewable energy, new uses of wood products, which is what this wood block is. This is the, I've been told, is a representative sample of the first commercially produced cross-laminated timber in the U.S., a new industry that we at USDA helped to sponsor. You'll now begin to see in cities across the United States multiple story buildings built solely from wood, storing that carbon and not allowing it to be burnt in a forest fire. You can take the diseased wood in the western part of the United States and you can produce this product. It's an amazing new opportunity. We have focused in these building blocks in our report on establishing precise goals each and every year using our traditional programs. So today we're also announcing an additional $72.3 million that will be committed through our EQIP program, Environmental Quality Incentive Program, that will be focused on soil health and nutrient stewardship, two drivers of emission reductions. We believe these 10 building blocks over the course of the next 15 years or so could help reduce emissions related to agriculture and contribute 2% to the 26 to 28% reduction goal the President has established. We're excited about the future. We see soil health. We see an increase in cover crops, 350% increase in cover crops. We see an increase in no-till on soil health. We see better water management with research projects that we're funding at USDA. Our nutrient stewardship program is focused on the right rate, the right time, the right amount, the right location, and the right application process, built based on tools that we've established at USDA to equip our farmers to be able to know precisely how to use nutrients in the most effective and efficient way, reducing inputs but also reducing emissions. We focused on renewable energy. Over 1,100 renewable energy projects have been financed in the last 7 years at USDA, helping to either save or produce almost 1 billion kilowatt hours of renewable energy, enough to basically take care of almost 1 million U.S. homes each and every year. We focused on better utilization of our forest programs in urban centers with a goal of adding an additional 100,000 trees in urban centers across the United States. What does this mean? It not only means better landscapes, it also means lower energy costs for neighborhoods. It means lower crime rates. It means increased property values. So all of this opportunity is being created through USDA's existing programs. And we're excited about the future. We believe this conference and this discussion is very timely and very important, which is why we've filed our report today, indicating the progress that we're making. The report will also indicate the overall milestones for each one of the building blocks. And so I'm very proud of the team at USDA for putting this together, making this announcement, and people are often asking the question, how does this continue from one administration to the next administration? And I think it's because the career people at USDA and the Forest Service are incredibly committed to this. They are incredibly committed to the research, to the innovation, to the utilization of our conservation programs, to the opportunities that our rural development programs provide for renewable energy. They are committed to this effort. And so I'm very, very hopeful and very optimistic that that 2% reduction will be met in emissions. I'm optimistic that our farmers will be equipped with the latest and best technology, best ways to provide more sustainable practices so that we will continue to produce at a level that we've been producing to meet the global food needs. I'm confident we're going to reduce food waste, and when we do domestically and internationally, we'll be able not only to reduce emissions and not only be able to adjust to a changing climate, but we'll also be able to aggressively approach the food insecurity needs of 850 million people globally. This is the work that's being done at USDA, sometimes not fully appreciated or understood, but I will tell you that we're working every single day to equip American agriculture to be a leader. So look forward to the conversation and discussion, and I will carry my little block here. You know, this is an amazing project that we sponsored with with $1 million that we put on the table. It was matched by $2 million in the Softwood Lumber Council and Board. Put this prize opportunity out there, and we got these two projects, a 10-story building in New York City that's going to be built with this, a 12-story construction project in Portland, Oregon that's going to be built with this. It's going to change the face and appearance of landscapes across the United States. And it's going to allow our wood industry, our timber industry, to reclaim some of the lost opportunities we've seen over the past. It's going to create jobs in rural areas, and it's helping to fuel already a decline in unemployment in the rural areas. It's helping to fuel opportunity for young people to come back to rural areas, so we've been able to reverse the recent population decline. And as importantly, we're also beginning to see a decline in the rural poverty rate. All of this a result of responding positively and proactively to this issue of climate change. We don't see this as a challenge, as we see it much more as an opportunity. Thank you. Want to take a seat here? All right, okay.
I'd like to invite our panelists up to the stage.
It does make a difference.
Secretary Vilsack, thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Greg Dotson. I'm the Vice President for Energy Policy at the Center for American Progress. I appreciated hearing your exciting news and learning of the investment and conservation practices today. Obviously, you sort of described the opportunity that climate change presents. There is challenges associated with it. We know that there's a major risk. Just looking at what happened with the drought in Texas and the Great Plains states a few years ago, that was a $41 billion drought, very important. And you know, Susie, I was thinking I would start off with you. $41 billion is a huge number. You know, it's a nationally economically significant number. What does that mean to the individual farmers on the ground?
From our work with farmers over the past 15 or 20 years, I think one thing that is very clear is there is no more normal. There is no normal crop year anymore, and that makes it incredibly hard to know how to manage, whether it's how much nutrients to apply, delays in getting into the field, and hearing from farmers that are still trying to plant in June or still trying to harvest in December. And all of that is incredibly difficult and stressful. And I've seen a lot of data that shows that there's been a 45% increase in the heaviest precipitation events in the last 50 years. And almost a third of U.S. corn production is in areas that are expected to face severe climate-induced water risk by 2050. And so those are two extremes that are incredibly hard to manage. But then when we go down to the farm field, and I've been out to visit one of our farmer advisors, a guy named Brent Bible in Indiana, and in 2013 I went to visit him, and he was telling me how the summer before, during the extreme drought in 2012, because he had been practicing cover crops and reduced tillage and using more data to manage his nutrients, while the drought hit him, he lost maybe a third of his crop. A lot of his neighbors had nothing. And I've seen similar things with another farmer that we work with a lot, Fred Yoder in Ohio. And it's made him so passionate about the ways that they can adapt that he is now not just doing these things on his own farm, but is very active and is a leader for the North American Alliance for ClimateSmart Agriculture. And so I see a lot more of those extremes and real challenges in managing those extremes. And one of the things that we have gotten very excited about is how those that farmers turn to most, in particular the ag retail sector, can play a real role in helping them figure out how to deal with those extremes and how to be more resilient and adapt. And we've been working with one company, United Suppliers, that has developed a whole program about how to help farmers manage their nutrients more efficiently, adopt cover crops, reduce tillage, to really meet these extreme weather events, adapt to climate, be able to address water quality challenges, and also see a new business opportunity as a lot of players in the supply chain are looking to make their own products and their own supply chains more sustainable.
That's great, thank you. And Susie, I was remiss in not introducing you. This is Susie Friedman, who's the Senior Director of Agricultural Sustainability at the Environmental Defense Fund. Thank you for joining us today. When people think about climate change, they oftentimes, and I know from my background, often think about cars and power plants. But of course, agriculture is a significant source of emissions, 9% of the U.S. of domestic emissions. When the United States came together with 195 other governments in Paris to try to agree to prevent warming from exceeding 1.5 degrees, it's an ambitious goal, and it's one that's going to require, to be successful, it's going to involve the constructive engagement of the agricultural sector. So with that, I'd like to introduce Chris Policinski. He's the president and CEO of Land O'Lakes. Land O'Lakes is a farmer-owned cooperative and one of the largest agribusinesses in the United States. Chris, thank you for joining us today.
Great, thanks very much for having me.
When you think about the challenge before us and the opportunities the Secretary described, how does Land O'Lakes fit into that? What are you doing, and what do you think others should be doing?
Yeah, it was a great question, Greg. Increasingly, we at Land O'Lakes see sustainability really as the business of our business, period. And that might sound funny because most people think of us as a butter company, and indeed that's how we were formed in the 20s by farmers who wanted us to aggregate their supply and sell high quality butter, and that worked well. What people don't know is shortly after that, those same farmers asked us to help them be more efficient in how they bought things. And we formed a feed division and a crop inputs division. If you turn the clock forward, those are still our three main focus areas. We have our Land O'Lakes Foods. We own Purina Animal Nutrition. We feed 100 million animals a day. And we have Winfield United Suppliers is a Land O'Lakes company, that focuses on improving productivity on farm for about a quarter of the farmers in America, about half the acreage. And if you put that footprint together, the light bulb really went off for us over the last few years, in part because of some of the commitments that were made with the help of the Secretary and the Department of Agriculture in the dairy industry, where a bold commitment was made in 2009. Right. With the Innovation Center, a consortium of dairy firms, to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 25% by 2020. And to be perfectly honest, we didn't quite know how we were going to get there. We had some building blocks, to use the same analogy the Secretary did. But as we got into that, it forced us at Land O'Lakes to say, we really are in the productivity business. And we really are able to use big data in both animal feed and crop inputs to get after more sustainable practices. Historically, we use big data for better animal nutrition and big data to help farmers maximize yields. And it doesn't take much of a turn to say, that data can be brought to bear on issues of sustainability, which really are issues of productivity and economics for farmers as well. So we've really changed our focus entirely. And we view sustainability of the business of our business. So what does that mean? In Purina, we're working on animal feeds that do improve health and nutrition, health and wellness of animals, animal well-being, but get after greenhouse gas emissions through limiting output. And that's led us to interesting discussions that we haven't solved yet about manure management and the role of methane digesters, and how do you make those economic for farmers, and how do you have maybe community digestion? Let's take a page out of the energy industry and community solar, community digesters. And in crop inputs, we're very, very excited, and we're working in partnership, Susie, with EDF, and it's a great partnership to put 10 million acres under focus to improve fertilizer usage and soil quality. I think that's about the biggest commitment that's been made. We think it's doable through big data. The same data that we use to show farmers how to maximize output in their climate, in their soil for the way they want to farm, big farms, small farms, and everything in between. We've got data. We've got test plots, 200 and some of them, and probably the best applied data bank of what works locally of anybody. We just pivot a little bit and say, all right, let's put that against nutrient management, fertilizer usage. And by the way, let's take advantage of the fact that we know most of the food firms and retailers in America pretty well from our food business. And they're very interested in this. And how do we end-to-end get some commitments going, taking a page out of the Innovation Center, to plant a stake and say, we can do this. So increasingly, we view this as a business of our business, and I hope everybody takes that the right way. When we bring the power of the market to get after these issues, we think there'll be more progress. And it's very central to who we are.
Thank you. Let's turn to forestry. Tim Punk is joining us today. He's a Senior Vice President for Corporate Affairs from Weyerhaeuser. Weyerhaeuser, of course, is an international forest products industry. They're one of the largest timber landowners in the United States. Tim, can you tell us what climate change means to your industry and your sector, and perhaps talk about some of the opportunities that the Secretary mentioned?
That's great. Thanks. First of all, let me just say thanks, Secretary Vilsack, to the work that you and USDA have done. We really appreciate the strong leadership on ClimateSmart policies, and the work that USDA has done on promoting wood products and working forests has just been a really terrific partnership. So let me step back for a second and just offer a little bit of perspective. Part of the reason that I was excited to join this industry 3 years ago is exactly because of the work that's going on in sustainability, the work that's going on in being a solution to climate change, and some of the really incredible kind of renewable and sustainable products that our industry and our sector produces. So if you start with with climate change, I think what's interesting about climate change is a lot of times when people talk about climate change in forests, they almost exclusively talk about deforestation and deforestation in other countries. And when you look at the rates of deforestation in other countries, it's a huge problem, and it's something that definitely deserves a lot of time and energy. But when you think about what is happening in the U.S., part of what we think about in the U.S. is a little bit different. It's really around how do we keep working forests as forests. And part of the way that we keep working forests as forests can be counterintuitive, but you want to make sure that there's markets for those forest products, exactly what the Secretary and USDA are kind of talking about. So you think about it from just kind of an economic perspective. Every private acre of land in the United States has a value. And if the value of that land is more as forest land, then it's more likely to stay as forest land. So that means we need to drive those markets for new and innovative forest products. And if you look at how that's played out over the last several years, actually the last 60 years in the United States, you can look at the U.S. South as a really good example of that. In the U.S. South, over the past 60 years, harvest has actually increased by 50%, but at the same time, forest inventory has doubled. From a Weyerhaeuser perspective, we've planted about 1 billion trees over the last 10 years, so we see how this plays out at a company level. So when we think about growing markets for wood, this is really, I think, where a lot of us in our industry get excited about some of the innovations that are happening in tall wood building and mass timber. And I think if you talk to architects and builders right now, there is just an incredible amount of excitement. This is the new thing in their industry. This is where there's, the tall wood building competition, I think, has created just a lot of excitement among architects about kind of what's the next product, what's the next building. That building in Portland, the building in Manhattan are just kind of, I think, be showcases for the industry. And what's interesting about this is this is really where the opportunity is. If you think about kind of growing markets in our sector, I mean, anybody who thinks, gosh, we need to build more with wood, you drive around the suburbs and you look at every house and it's sort of being built with wood. But the opportunity really is in the commercial sector, where wood represents a relatively small percentage of the market. And from a climate perspective, I think it's important to think about buildings. Greg, you mentioned often when we think about climate, we think about cars or transportation, or we think about power plants. Interestingly, I think buildings are where we don't spend enough time thinking about. And buildings account for about 40% of greenhouse gas emissions, 40%. So if we can start thinking about smarter, greener, more sustainable buildings, we've got a lot of opportunity there. And if you think about building with wood, you can think about kind of three things when it comes to buildings and climate change. First, building with wood uses less energy than traditional building products. It emits less greenhouse gases, 26% less greenhouse gas emissions than steel, 31% less greenhouse gas emissions than concrete. Second, when you build with wood, as the Secretary mentioned, you store that carbon for the life of the building. And you continue that cycle. You continue that opportunity for the forest land to stay as forest land because you're creating markets for that wood. The last point that I would make here is that policy matters, and policy matters a lot. In the United States, standard building codes allow for 5-story wood buildings. And yet we know we can build 10, 20, even 30-story buildings made out of these new mass timber products. It's happening increasingly in places like Europe and Canada. And thanks to the leadership in some of our cities and some of the help from USDA, it's happening now in Portland, in places like New York. And Portland's really been a leader in kind of this idea behind green building and innovation. I would also say that this is a bipartisan issue in a town where that seems to be more and more rare these days. And so last week we were excited to see the introduction of the Timber Innovation Act by Senators Crapo and Cantwell, Stabenow, Daines, and Klobuchar, which really was designed to promote wooden buildings and promote some of the things that USDA is doing. So appreciate USDA's leadership on this and the opportunity to talk about these issues today.
Great, thank you very much. And I'd just like to say to the audience, please get your questions ready. We'll turn to the audience for questions in a few minutes, and I don't want to catch you flat-footed. Well, it's great to hear about the constructive engagement that's happening from the industry. Secretary Vilsack, I know that if your plans are successful, we'll reduce carbon emissions by 120 million metric tons. To put that into perspective, that's equivalent to taking 93 million cars off the road or closing 116 coal-fired power plants. That would just be a tremendous accomplishment. And I think in a budget-strapped town, which we now are, I think the obvious question is, do you think that the department has the resources it needs to accomplish that, and do you have the relationships with the communities to accomplish it?
Yes, no, and maybe. I don't think there's any question in the conservation space. We've got the resources, as we're announcing today, to be able to partner with our farm families to continue to promote conservation. We're seeing a record number of acres enrolled in conservation and record participation. And we've created some innovative and creative ways to leverage our dollars through the Regional Conservation Partnership Program that's really looking at large landscape scale projects instead of one-off projects, coordinating, evaluating, and knowing that if we have a suite of conservation practices combined, we can have a much more beneficial effect. And I think we are seeing farmers embrace the notion of cover crops and no-till, and they're making the case that conservation can be profitable. It's not an expense, it's an opportunity. So in that sense, I think we will have the resources. Our rural development resources, I think, will always be there to promote renewable energy projects. I think there's a real need for this and a desire for solar, for wind, for a variety of ways in which to produce renewable energy. We've done over 200 anaerobic digesters with the dairy industry, and that's going to continue. That partnership's going to continue. The no comes in the forest area. Deeply concerned right now about the fact that 52% of our Forest Service budget has gone to fire suppression. Now that's not storing carbon, that's emitting it, okay? And the reality is that Congress has the power and the capacity to stop that, to reverse that, to go back to the day when we were spending 16% of our budget for suppression and 84% to make our forests more resilient and to restore them. We're urging Congress to finally take action. So if they take action, then I'll be more confident in our ability to promote more wood to energy projects, more prizes and innovations in the wood space. We're going to continue to do what we can with the limited resources. The maybe, I think, relates primarily to the issue of water. And I think we are now trying to learn what we can do to use water more efficiently and effectively. There's a wonderful project in Nebraska now where they're looking at where we help to finance more improved and efficient irrigation. They're now saving billions of gallons of water that they were otherwise using for irrigation. I think if we're able to do more of that research and we're able to fund that research and we're able to get it into the marketplace, then I think there's no question that each one of those building blocks is going to contribute. We'll get to the 120 million metric ton equivalent. That's double the rate today, and I have no doubt in my mind we can get there. But it is going to take a few twists and turns in Congress to get us the Forest Service budget right, and I think we're going to have to continue to invest in innovation.
So we have the executive branch, we have the private sector, but we need the legislative branch to do its
Well,
part as well.
certainly on the Forest Service budget, there's no question about this. I mean, there's no excuse for this. There's no excuse. Every member of Congress knows this is a problem. Every member of Congress knows that we can't continue to fight fires. We have to do a better job of restoring and making our forests more resilient. There are different attitudes about how to get there. And, you know, this is an area that ought to be bipartisan. This is an area that ought to foster compromise, and this is the year for that to happen.
Greg, if I can build on one of the comments the Secretary made, because it's, you know, the resources is one question. The other question you hear a lot of, do these programs work? And I will tell you from a private sector perspective, we're part of a couple of programs in the RCPP, funded in the 14 Farm Bill. And they work. They work because you get down to regional or local focus. You bring in partners. We've got a project in Indiana focusing on a watershed that has some challenges. With a little bit of funding, with some private sector engagement, we brought in one of our partners that's in that area that's trusted by the local farmers, Serious Solutions. They've put some money in. We've got some money from the department. We've put some money and in-kind resources in, and we're making progress. So it's not just the funding, it's is it effective? And I can tell you in that program, we really look at it and say, this is the right kind of tool.
The program has been really useful, and there are so many opportunities for even more public-private partnership, leveraging programs like the Regional Conservation Partnership Program and MOUs like the one you mentioned with dairy. And I think that there are big opportunity and big need for even more of those. We're part of one recent RCPP with a partner, collaborator of ours, Smithfield Foods in North Carolina, focused on their feed grain efficiency. And as I look at the growing number of food companies in particular that are now really paying attention to the sustainability of their supply chains and looking to engage, you know, there are all sorts of private sector things that need to happen through that chain, and big opportunities, I think, for NGOs to play a role in that. But then partnering with USDA, whether it's through an MOU or using a program like RCPP, or just better coordinating how the growers in that supply chain leverage the EQIP program.
Right. You know, another example of a partnership and the impact that agriculture can have on another industry is the partnership we have with Weyerhaeuser and other timber companies to produce drop-in aviation and marine fuel. We basically at USDA invested $80 million in research in Washington State University and Washington University to create this new industry. Didn't exist before. The ability to have a drop-in biofuel, in part made from woody biomass. This is going to help the commercial airline industry reduce its emissions. And United Airlines has recently announced 12,500 flights out of LAX that will be fueled with a blended fuel, and over time we're going to get to a point where it's not going to have to be blended. It's going to be totally bio-based. This is going to create jobs. It's going to reduce emissions. It's going to help us maintain the forest more effectively. That's why I'm excited about the opportunity here. I think we have a tendency to look at this climate change issue as an incredibly difficult challenge, but with the innovative spirit in this country, there's just an unlimited amount of opportunity, and agriculture and forestry is going to play an incredible role. And what's really exciting about it is that landowners, farmers, they're excited about this. They want information. They want to know what to do because at the end of the day, their land, their water is the most precious resource they have.
Great. So I think, and turning to these, turning to more of a consumer focus on this. Today, the Center for American Progress released a report about creating a sustainable food system in the United States. And I guess we see climate change as a challenge related to that. I was just wondering how you, Mr. Secretary, think about how those issues interact. Consumer food availability, food security, especially for low-income families, and climate change.
Well, there's no question that we have a huge challenge in terms of food security in the future. We've got to increase productivity globally by 60 to 70% in the next 30 to 40 years, and that's going to require a pace of innovation that we've never seen before in agriculture. And we need to do it in a way that is sustainable, a way in which it restores the health of soil, that protects the quality of water. And we need to do it, frankly, in a way that's going to be profitable for farmers. You can't have sustainability and social welfare if it's not economically feasible. You're just going to drive people out of business, or you're going to drive people to figure out ways around all of that. I think there are ways. That's why we put up these climate hubs. We want to basically be able to identify the technologies, the strategies, the ways to approach farming that allow producers to begin thinking about diversification, diversity of crops. We have in parts of our country been pretty standard corn, beans, corn, beans, corn, beans. I think we're beginning to see more farmers look at a different rotation because at the end of the day, it's going to be the yields are going to be increased, and I think that's a positive opportunity for enhanced sustainability. We're looking at ways in which we learn more about animal feed, greater efficiency, so that we can basically reduce the level of methane that's produced. And once it's produced, we can capture it with digesters. So I think there are models, and frankly, we're also looking at diversifying the size of operations. This is not just one big commercial operation here that has the wherewithal to do all of these new technologies. It's also a local and regional food system that reduces the level of transportation from producer to consumer. You're not traveling 1,000 miles to sell something to somebody. You're traveling a couple miles down the road to a farmer's market, or your children are consuming something at the local school that was produced locally. So there are a multitude of ways in which USDA is trying to create a more diversified farming operation within the U.S., and we believe strongly that diversification and diversity is part of sustainability, both in crop production, methods of production, producers themselves, size of operations.
And Greg, if I might build on it, I mean, I think it's terrific that the Center for American Progress has put out a point of view on sustainable food production, because one of the things that I observe is that there's great interest by a lot of parties in where their food comes from, and we ought to celebrate that. Consumers are more interested. They're pushing on retailers. Retailers are pushing on food firms. It's great, but the dialogue right now needs to get richer. We need folks to come in and think about fact and science and how this industry has made that great progress that Secretary Vilsack mentioned from when he was born to today, a lot more with less inputs. What has driven that? And be more inclusive in agriculture. We need farms of all sizes. We need big farms that use lots of technology. And in fact, much of the progress we've made has been technology enabled. But consumers don't often think of that. And we need to explain why that's good and safe and produces abundant, healthy food. We also need these diverse food systems. We need small farmers to be the next incubator, or the incubator, the next great idea to create these local systems that don't have expensive transportation and create other issues. But our debate needs to get richer by a lot, because right now so much is being shaped by opinion or nostalgia. Well intended, there are no bad actors in this movie, but I see some risk there. And the solution to that is to pleasantly engage and have folks who are objective comment on food system and bring fact and science to bear on the discussion.
So let me just comment on that too, because I think that the agriculture sector has just done a terrific job here of actually communicating and engaging in that dialogue with consumers and with thought leaders on these issues. It's a place where I think all of us, and certainly including in our sector, could learn a lot. And part of what they're doing is, as Chris said, is engaging in that dialogue in a really transparent, open way about where our food comes from and why sustainability is important and what that sector is doing about sustainability. And in part what they're also doing is they're driving that demand for sustainable products, which is equally important. This is something that our sector has looked at and wants to replicate, frankly, in terms of how do we kind of continue to drive that demand for sustainable products by engaging in that dialogue with consumers, with conservation groups. And so it's I think you all have done great work there.
If I can add one more thing on that. I think also we need a pretty, as you say, a different, more richer dialogue on that, and a real recognition very broadly that for us really to tackle climate and water quality and be able to have food security, sustainability can't be just another label or another niche market. It needs to be mainstream agriculture and as you say, the part of the business of mainstream agriculture. So we need that change, and we also need that to be embraced. Too often I think the dialogue is, okay, if you're big, you can't be sustainable, and the reality is, well, if big can't be sustainable, whether it's in terms of a big company or a larger farm or a larger landscape, then we're never going to get to the place that we need to be if we're going to be climate smart and have water quality and address water risk and also have plentiful food to meet nutritional needs.
I think people would be surprised about how some of the larger commercial enterprises have embrace sustainability. I think there's a lot of work in that space, and it gets back to the need for agriculture to continue to message. I often say to my farm friends, they do a great job of talking to each other, not such a good job at talking to the 99% of the folks who don't farm. And I think there's a growing awareness of the need to do that. And I think that's why I was pleased with the recent survey that shows that 90% of Americans have a high opinion of farmers generally, which is, I think, a positive. Sometimes I think farmers feel that they're sort of not valued in this country. And that survey suggested that maybe that's not correct. Maybe they are valued. And I think that's an important message to send to farmers, that you are valued. We want to help. We want to partner. We want to work towards a more sustainable future.
Well, all of you talked about the need for additional dialogue, so I think we're playing a small part
Right.
in that today. I want to just go to one more issue, and then we're going to take some questions from the audience. As we've talked a lot about this as a domestic issue, about meeting our goals for an international agreement, but what about the actual approaches and technologies and the climate-smart building blocks? How do those translate? How do those engage the international discussion on climate change and agriculture and forestry? And I'd like to ask all the panelists about this.
Well, let me begin. We had this conversation at the recent G7 agricultural minister meeting, and we had the same conversation at the G20 agricultural minister meeting. I think there's a genuine desire for information and for what works and for data. And I think the rest of the world is looking to the United States for leadership. That's why I think they were pleased when we basically were an initial signatory to the ClimateSmart Agricultural Alliance. That is a way in which all of the research that we're doing, all of the practices in conservation, all the renewable energy efforts can be funneled through that alliance in terms of best practices and shared with the rest of the world. And we're happy to do that. And I think we reflected a willingness and openness with our Open Data Initiative, where we're essentially saying we're going to make the data that we are collecting, the information, the research that we're doing, we're going to make it more accessible and more available and more usable so that you can have easy access to it. And I think we're also seeing more exchanges from our own farmers traveling to other countries, willing to share what we're doing, and frankly picking up a couple of tips from folks in other countries. This is not a situation where U.S. agriculture has exclusive knowledge. We have to learn from the rest of the world as well. And I think there's an openness and willingness to do this, and we've conveyed that through the Alliance. And the last thing I would say is we're also doing this in terms of making sure, as I mentioned earlier, the Global Research Alliance is a concerted effort on our part to work to ensure that we don't replicate or duplicate or waste time with innovation. And our effort on food loss and waste is focused on waste here in the U.S., but on food lost through our Feed the Future initiative, where we're looking at post-harvest loss and trying to reduce that with better storage internationally. And that, of course, will allow us to not have to get into the deforestation issues, because we'll be using more of the land more effectively and efficiently of what's already being grown. And frankly, if we reduced all the food waste and loss in the world today, we would be able to feed every single food insecure person in the world today. So it's an enormous opportunity for us.
Greg, I'll chime in and with a different perspective. One of the luxuries of being a farmer-owned company is their value system is expressed through us in many regards. And about 40 years ago, our farmers said, we've always wanted to help out our neighborhood, but let's define the neighborhood as the world. So we formed a global development group. And over that time, to work on food insecurity and help build the food infrastructure in parts of the world that were desperate. So we've been in 70 countries, 350 projects over those 40 years. And my view is shaped by that experience when I think about the global food and ag market and challenge. And I suppose the one thing I'll comment on, to not be redundant to anything the Secretary said, was we have to be very careful we don't impose a rich country's view from the United States or developed Europe on developing countries. And it's very important to think about that carefully and engage intellectually in that. Because sometimes the solutions in the developing world are kind of like Land O'Lakes in the 20s, pretty basic. We don't need a lot of technology. We need better advice, some better basic agronomic practices. Sometimes the solution might be our best and highest technology. There are some drought-stricken parts of Africa right now that are in desperate shape, and people are dying. And I look at those parts of the world and those countries, and I won't be specific, are afraid of biotechnology. Why? Because Europe and the developed country has a dialogue around biotech that scares them. And I think, boy, if we could get a drought-tolerant seed to that country right now, we'd save lives. And we have to be very careful that when we look at global food systems, that we don't impose a rich country's view of what the solution is. we impose we help with a much broader view of what might work. And it's going to be, one size will not fit all. Sometimes low tech, sometimes high tech is the solution for those countries.
Yeah.
Part of what I think is important, and we've talked about this a little bit today in the panel, is we've got to drive that demand for sustainable products, right? So from a U.S. perspective, I mean, part of what we do really well is we consume, right? And part of what we also need to do is we need to think about what we're consuming and how do we actually drive that demand and kind of keep raising ourselves up the ladder of sustainability. So, you know, I think from a forest products perspective, you know, one of the ways we think about that is we think about third-party certification of forest land and forest products. And for that perspective, I think, you know, labels matter. And so, you know, when you pick up, you know, a 2x4, when you pick up a magazine, or when you pick up some paper, you know, what does it say on there? Is it third-party certified in terms of where that fiber has come from and how that product is made? So, you know, from a Weyerhaeuser perspective, we certify all 13 million acres of our land to the Sustainable Forestry Initiative. There are lots of other great third-party certifications out there. That's the one that we use. There's the American Tree Farm, and Europe has its own. But the label matters, and we increasingly need to think about how do we drive that value for sustainable products.
Susie, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I would just add that, you know, I think the leadership of USDA and what came out of Paris creates a real opportunity looking forward in terms of what can be accomplished in terms of the policy opportunities and collective action and collaboration within countries and across countries, but then the role that the private sector can play both in supporting those policy advancements but driving their own demand and having those things really sync up, I think, is what is really going to make a difference, because sometimes policies can move quickly and sometimes they take a little bit longer. And if the private sector is coming in and saying, well, we want to be able to reduce the risk in our supply chain, we want these things produced sustainably, I think that can help move things forward and even clear some way for the policies to come in as well.
You know, Chris's point was well taken about not imposing and basically listening. As you were talking, I was thinking about our own livestock industry and the issue of rotational grazing, something that we sort of need to be reminded of, but something that is happening in other parts of the world pretty effectively. That's part of our building block, is to make sure that we have more and more acres that are being rotationally grazed, so that we do it right, and that's a lesson we can learn from the rest of the world.
Thank you. Why don't we, in our last few minutes here, take some questions from the audience. What I'd like to do is ask the folks to identify themselves, and maybe we'll take like 3 questions and answer them. Let's take a read here in the front.
The panel has, I'm Reed Dutchin with the United Nations Foundation. The panel has described what I'd say is a pivot from seeing these sectors as part of the climate problem to be part of the climate solution. And you've described, I think, some excitement in the farm community about that switch. But it feels to me that this opportunity is very poorly understood, number one, by the general public, and most especially by the environmental community, which sees, generally speaking, production agriculture as bad and the idea of working forests as bad, when in fact, if you do it right, it's an essential part of the solution. Could you comment on how that perspective can be turned around?
Why don't we actually take that question and then we'll take some after that.
Well, you know, it gets back to enriching the debate, and I want to come back. I don't think there are any bad actors in this movie. I think that oftentimes we approach this from silos and a narrow view. And one of the challenges in these sectors is they are very broad. And, you know, when you push on one part, you often get a consequence that you didn't think of over here. And I think if we work better with a lot of the environmental groups to understand their point of view, which is often, you know, fairly specific, and put that in a context and have a debate that's pleasant, not divisive, the debate gets more robust. So that was part of my conversation, or my comment, that we have to enrich the debate. We have to be more inclusive, and we have to realize there are no bad actors in this movie. Secretary Vilsack said it. I don't know anybody who's more concerned about the land and natural resources than a farmer. They want to keep these in their family for generations. And they have a great track of productivity, and the pivot to get to sustainability needs to be enabled. But this is a dialogue that we need to get aligned on, not divided on.
At USDA, we're creating opportunities for that conversation to take place. We mentioned the Regional Conservation Partnership. That is bringing a lot of folks who don't normally get together in the same room at the same time to talk about the same thing to be able to do that. There's an incentive for all of us. In fact, what we've seen is a doubling of our money with someone else's money that's going into conservation. We also see this in the Forest Service. Our forest planning rule focuses on climate, focuses on water. It's now focused on a collaborative process. We find that if we collaborate, we can reduce the number of lawsuits, we can speed up the process of restoration and do it in a sustainable way. And we're also doing it in rural development. We're reaching out to the private sector and foundations to say, hey, there are investment opportunities in sustainable practices here that you need to know about. We haven't done a particularly good job of informing you about them. Now we are. Help us create a more vibrant economy. So I think USDA and the government can provide the catalyst for that kind of collaborative conversation. And with our programs and our resources, we can maybe incent that conversation to move a little quicker than it might otherwise.
So part of what I'd say, I mean, first of all, I think it's a great question. And what I would say is, look, we've got to engage in two things. We've got to engage in partnerships, and we've got to engage in education and communication. And I think on the partnership side, I think the Tallwood building, presents just a really incredible example of how partnerships has worked. The Softwood Lumber Board is, a group of companies from around North America that has basically looked at this issue and tried to figure out how can we partner with government, how can we partner with ourselves, how can we partner with conservation groups and NGOs to move this dialogue forward. And I think part of the reason that you're seeing a lot of success on this is because of that partnership and because of the communication that we've had. And then on the communication side, again, this is a place where, I mean, just, if I can be self-critical, our sector has not been great on communication. I think there's about 35 of us from, the 10 million of us on social media, and we've actually got to, start engaging in that conversation a lot better than we do. We've got a great story to tell, but if we don't tell that story, we can't create these partnerships, we can't move forward these innovative products, so we got to do better there.
Right.
Yeah, I would just quickly add, I mean, I work in Environmental Defense Fund, so we're among the converted that looking for partnerships and business opportunities is the way to really get change at scale. But I think one of the things that can really help that dialogue is transparency. And I think that can really enhance trust and open up a different dialogue if instead of just saying, don't trust us, we'll do it. Show some information, share the data that really shows that change is happening, I think can really change that dynamic.
We're doing that with the report that we're issuing today, saying this is what we're going to do, this is how far we've gone, this is where we want to go.
And I assume that report is available on your website.
Yes, USDA.gov.
Great, let's take a few more questions. Right here in front.
Hi, I'm Marisa Endicott from the Medill News Service. And going back to when we touched a little bit on sustainable foods, there's been a big rise in demand for kind of fresh and responsibly sourced meats and ingredients in the chain fast food and fast casual dining setting. And I was wondering how that need for these types of ingredients and meats on such a larger scale will impact the large scale and factory farm industries, and how these big scale farms can kind of adapt, or what they're doing now to adapt to this increased demand.
Let's just take two more questions and we'll stack them up. There's a gentleman back there in the blue blazer who had his hand up early.
Yes, I'm Dr. Sam Hancock of Emerald Planet TV, and thank you for putting this on. Two-part question, but very short. How can we work more closely together? And I think you've answered some of this for both air and soil quality by emphasizing water management, both techniques and processes. And then how are you working with the major land-grant research universities in all these different fields?
Great, thank
Thank
you.
you.
Let's just take one more, the woman there on the...
Yes, good morning. My question relates to how universities and colleges, agricultural schools within them, particularly in the Midwest, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Nebraska, whether their agricultural schools are stepping up or tied to the past, and whether for the private sector folks, whether they're producing the kind of graduate students or graduates that you all find are the kinds you want to hire.
Those last two questions seem to go together very well, so who would like to respond?
I'll comment on the first question, and I think that we need to listen to what the marketplace wants and provide products that the market wants. We also need to broaden the discussion of the consequences of those things. And that's part of enriching the debate. So when we talk about fresh and local and we're reducing transportation and we can objectively with data show that has an environmental benefit, terrific way to show that. I think we ought to also be more disciplined about what kinds of segments are emerging in the food industry and the end-to-end benefit and cost of serving those segments. So I think there's a lot of discussion around different segments, and I think one of your comments was fresh or not factory farm. I wish we got rid of that term factory farm, because to be more inclusive, by the way, we need large farms using technique, we need small farms, boutiques, and producing different products and using different techniques. But I think we need to do a better job of engaging with the consumer, listening to what they want, and talking about the consequences of that. Some of the consequences, serving a market segment, it might be more profitable for farmers. Terrific, that's economic sustainability, that's allowing reinvestment in lots of good practices. Some of the consequences might be more land or water use. How do we feel about that? So I think we have to enrich that particular part of the discussion. I believe in serving consumer markets, and we ought to listen well and serve those markets, but we need to have a much broader discussion about the benefits and costs of serving segments in the food industry.
Just a couple of things. I think the cage-free eggs is a good example of the industry basically making an adjustment, listening to the message that the market is sending. And we're beginning to see a lot more investment in new technologies on the farm that will increase the production of cage-free eggs because the market is saying that's what we want. I think Chris is right. I think we have to be cognizant of the costs associated with all of this. We enjoy in this country relatively inexpensive food. And if you ask the consumer, do you want cage-free eggs, do you want this or that sustainable practice, I would be surprised if 95% of the people didn't say yes. But that's not the question that should be asked at times. Maybe the question should be asked, would you be willing to pay a nickel more for your food per pound in exchange for more sustainable practices? That percentage might be a little different depending upon people. So I think that enriches the conversation by looking at all aspects of this. On the issue of water management, we have a specific water initiative with land-grant universities. We set aside from our AFRI program, our competitive research program, $30 million, and it's going into universities across the United States. I'm really excited about the work the University of Tennessee is doing on livestock and the utilization of grazing practices that could potentially save water. I'm very interested in the Nebraska project that I mentioned earlier. There is a close collaboration because we are partnering with these land-grant universities, and we're encouraging collaboration with those land grants, not just the traditional larger land-grant universities, but also the minority-serving land-grant institutions as well, so that there's a real collaborative effort. And in terms of opportunities, we did a survey recently, Purdue University did a survey. There are about 60,000, 57 to 60,000 job opportunities available in agriculture and agribusiness. We're only training about 35,000. So I'm telling young people this is an amazing opportunity, and I think they're getting that message because we're seeing enrollments in ag colleges increasing significantly. And as you get these young people enrolling in these ag colleges, they will compel change. They will force change. They will ask their college to focus not just on large-scale production agriculture. That'll be part of it. They'll want to know how to set up a local and regional food system. They'll want to know how to set up an urban farm. They'll be interested in rooftop farming. They'll be interested in school gardens. They'll be interested in a lot of activities that we currently are funding at USDA and supporting in order to diversify agriculture.
If I could build on it in a sense, our business has been growing, and as we look at sustainability being more of the business, we've said we need more talent into our system. So we are very engaged in this discussion, and we went and did some surveys, Land O'Lakes surveys, some market research. And we found young folks entering college, 20% are interested in maybe having a career in healthcare. Another 20% are interested in having a career in technology. And another 20% are interested in global businesses. And when you ask a specific question about agriculture, here's the answer that we got back through our research, which may or may not be parallel to some of the other research that's been done, I know, by the department. 3% of incoming college students said agriculture. I don't think it's because of the content of what ag as an industry has to offer. I think it's because we've described it poorly. Back to your point, we talk among ourselves well, but we don't say, what's more central to health and wellness than our food systems? what's more entrepreneurial and global than food? And in fact, what's driven that great productivity story over generations but the application of different kinds of technology by farmers and quickly trying technology on and doesn't fit, they'll move on to the next one. This is a global, high-tech entrepreneurial business that has a pretty noble purpose, by the way, feeding people in an increasingly sustainable way. We need to talk about that more and more pleasantly with young folks, because right now they have the right pieces, but they don't associate agriculture with them. And we need to talk about agriculture more broadly. Tim, one of your points.
I'm sorry, I got to say. Here's the problem with this. Farmers don't necessarily sell themselves particularly well. Older farmers will say, good Lord, this is hard work. Good Lord, we're overtaxed and overregulated. That's their pitch. Who's buying that? The better pitch is, this is one of the most innovative places in the economy today and has been in the past. This is a place that could actually redesign the entire American economy into a bio-based economy, not necessarily a fossil fuel-based economy. This is an opportunity to feed the world and provide American leadership. This is an opportunity to provide national security through food security. I mean, there are a multitude of ways to really market this to bright young people. We don't do a particularly good job of that.
Well, and look, I mean, it's exactly part of the reason that Portland has been so successful in sustainable urban buildings, green buildings, is in part because of the partnership that they have with Oregon State University, where they're building this incredible new forestry school built out of mass timber, where they're going to use that to kind of educate folks about kind of our industry and the technology that's happening in our industry, and also create that next pipeline of workers. So universities are an incredibly important part of the success of both agriculture and forestry.
And then the 2 points that I would add, I agree, in terms of consumer demand for more sustainable production. I think transparency is going to be really key here, because the reality is that sustainability is not determined by size, it's determined by performance. And you can have amazing, unbelievably sustainable performance at a very small scale, and at a very large scale you can also have not so great sustainability at a very small scale and a very large scale. And so I think the more we can have transparency into the kind of management that is going on, and bringing that to consumers so they can make a choice whether, okay, well, it's local that matters most to them. Well, that's different, and they can be the same, but they're not necessarily the same as the most sustainable way to meet that food demand. And so the more we can have information, the more you can make a choice for what you're actually after. And then in terms of the land-grant universities, they are really, really important. And I think this is where we also need to look at different ways of working together across government, across land-grant universities, across the private sector, and how they can work together. Because I think one of the harsh realities is that the budgets for land grants have been cut back and cut back and cut back, and I don't see that changing, but I think there are incredible partnerships that can bring the kind of expertise and knowledge that land grants have into the private sector. And just one more example, I'll take it from the Land O'Lakes United Suppliers work with the program Sustain. Training is a huge part of that program to get the how do you manage sustainably moving out through those ag retailers to the farmers they work with. And land-grant university experts are a key part of being that training. And I think that's one place where you can have, okay, you might have, a quarter or even less the staff you might have had, 10 years ago or 20 years ago. But if you can put that expertise in the middle of a big company that is working with farmers across tens of millions of acres, the impact can be very large.
Thank you so much. And we've gone slightly over our time. I want to thank the audience for joining us today, and I hope you'll join me in thanking all of our panelists for a fascinating conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to see you again. Yeah.
Thank you so much.